Have a pretty short agenda this week. It's great to see everybody. Welcome to the PWA Community Sync call for April 5th. We have a very small thing to let's see, discuss right now. First, nope, I think it's not that small. I think we actually have the MFDF demo. I was looking at the wrong agenda. So what we have to talk about today is, first of all, we're going to get a demonstration of the end-to-end testing suite that our fine QA person, Dev Patil, has been developing and working with. So he's using the Magento functional test framework so that we have the same tooling for PWA Studio as we have for other Magento front ends. You can start with that, and then James Kalkaman is going to have a coding standards document to show. We got together and started to codify and make clearer the way that the project is organized so that you can kind of see our thinking and see how to make new features that fit those standards. And there's some neat new upward documentation that's in the works that we can also look at. We have some first issues and some help wanted issues that we might want to describe a little bit better so that some new folks can start making contributions. And then, of course, as always, we can open the floor to questions, concerns, or interesting stuff to demo from anyone in the community. So first off, does anyone have urgent things to share, or should we get started with Deb? All right. Well, I urgently have to share that I really don't like blue jeans. That's all I got. Dev, would you like to start? Would you like to start with the functional testing demo?
Yeah, sure. Can you all hear me?
Awesome. So I'll give you the floor.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Can you all see my page screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So as James mentioned, this is a Magento testing framework, which is being used to test Magento backend and like Luma storefront. But our MQ team added some new functions just to support PWA. And currently we have a set of like 10 test cases, and basically if you just go through the names and you can understand like what is actually doing. Like we have for test for create account, customer sign in, forgot password, checkout, edit card, remove item, and search functionalities. And one good thing about these tests are like each test creates its own data and tests on the data, and after that it cleans up the data. And for that we are using APIs, which is like a built-in functionality in Magento framework. And I will quickly show one test run.
Dev, would you mind increasing the font size in your editor? I think there are some of us who have a hard time reading it.
Okay. Any shortcut for that? Never tried that.
Oh, you know what? This is WebStorm, so I think somebody probably else on the call can do it. I don't use WebStorm much.
I believe you can enter the presentation mode.
Oh, yeah.
At least there is on PHP Storm and should be on the web.
Right.
If it takes more than a second, you don't have to worry about it.
Usually Command plus is a shortcut for zooming in or increasing font size.
Yeah, I tried
It
that.
often is.
It's not working.
Yeah, but not in IntelliJ. You can also try holding the control button and scrolling, because in some IntelliJ instances, that's already pre-configured to work.
Yeah, This is console stuff. It works if you have enabled it. If it is
Presentation
disabled, it
mode
doesn't
should be
work.
under View.
Sorry.
Presentation mode, it should be under the View menu item. Your navbar at the top, with it should say View, and there should be presentation mode under there.
Yeah, in the view menu, there might be presentation mode. If you don't have a view menu, then potentially it's in the PHP Storm menu.
This is
In any case,
well too.
but yeah, you don't need to worry about it. I think it's not necessarily important for us to read every word, so I don't want to take away from your time.
Okay. So currently I'm just giving an example how I'm running a test. So I'm running a search functionality test. I cannot say I think my Google Chrome which is running, but can you all see my command prompt?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. So here it is like it's first creating a data for testing, like it's creating categories, configurable products, and once it's done with that, the test will actually start testing on a UI on a Chrome browser. So, okay, so now it's basically triggering the UI part, and it's testing now. And as you see, like we have some like hard-coded wait time, and for this we have a bug reported for our MQE team, and they are working on it. So search test is basically like I am inputting some search strings, and based on that I am asserting the proper output. And once the test is complete, so again you can see like all the data I created before the test, now it's being cleaned up. Yep. So that's a test, like a single test run, and quickly. Okay, and like if you go to like Magento Research PWA test repo, you can see the instructions, and if anyone new to MFTF, they can go through this document to understand how MFTF works. And setup is very simple. You just need to have a Chrome driver and Selenium server. And after that, you clone this repository and do these instructions. And on running test, like currently we can run like two ways. One, you can give the test name, and other is like you give the group name which runs all the tests in the suite. So currently, like all the tests have group called PWA. So if you just run the group PWA, it runs all those 10 tests. And currently, as part of each PR testing, I am running these tests. And after that, like we are making sure like it's a QA complete. And there is one more bug. So currently, like by default, the wait for Ajax loads. This is basically built for Magento Luma framework. That's why it's not working for PWA. But I reported the bug, and again, the MQA team will I think look into it and they will provide a fix. But just for a quick fix, we just need to go to this particular file and comment this line. Yep. That's it. I had any questions?
Are these tests written to be consumed by anyone outside the, like, I saw a lot of DOM tree nodes that were very specific and product IDs that were very specific, which could potentially make the tests very brittle or of limited use. Are there ways to modify those nodes or those product IDs to make them more extensible for greater reuse of this test suite?
No, so you mean these product names, the one I highlighted?
When I saw the test running, I saw document fragments, node fragments being tested against CSS selectors that looked like they were very specific, as well as specific product IDs.
No, so that's what, so just to go back, that's what I was talking, like each test creates its own data. So it creates the data, and the same data it's using file testing. So you can just clone the project and try running tests. It should work. There's nothing is being hard coded there.
Okay, so it's not looking for a specific hard coded product ID. It's just grabbing any product ID from the product table.
Right. Not okay. Let me go back to my PHP. Just a minute.
It actually inserts the products into the database in the backing instance. So it's not looking for an arbitrary product ID. It's creating the product and then pulling the product back out in the UI.
Got it.
Is that correct, Dev?
Yep, that's right.
Similarly, for the document fragments, when it was looking for particular CSS, presumably that it would have to know the structure of the DOM. I don't know how extensible that is or not. I'm just thinking of people are going to want to write their own templates and how reusable or abstracted out that is, so that you could test against known or arbitrary ones. So like these selectors, a person's going to, if they were to modify them or use different templates, they would have to then go into these tests and modify those selectors.
Yes, right. So based on the template, the selector has to be defined, and that's like a prerequisite for the Selenium tests.
Got it. Yeah. So any templates that don't follow this rigid format would fail. Which, I mean, I understand that, it's a test, that's the nature of the test, but it isn't, like, I guess, further abstracted where you pass in certain selectors or whatnot. But that's fine. I understand how it's set up now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we've talked about that to some degree of detail, Keith. There's, first of all, as we're going to show in the next demo, an increasingly strict and clear set of best practices for how to define class names in the paired CSS file with a component. And dev CSS selectors, you might notice they're already complex selectors that use attribute matching, front matching, so that the auto-generated and namespace CSS classes will still work. So we're moving in that direction. Additionally, it may be possible to reflect out the generated class names in future work. But for now, this is a really portable approach compared to some of the early testing and some of the other test systems that prevail in the PWA industry. So it's true that if you violated a convention, then the class names would not match. That's certainly true, but we want to get this more and more robust over time, and it looks fantastic, Dev.
Thank you. Yep, that's it.
Any other questions? No one else?
Wait,
Okay.
sorry, had my mic muted. Or
Okay.
did I just miss my spot? But just a
Go
question. Wouldn't it be better to use a custom data attribute instead of classes? So that the developers that are building the front end would know that you can just change the classes, but the data attribute would be something like Magento test and then an ID for a search or something like that?
Yeah, I
Test
do
only
agree.
attributes. Sorry, go on. You can answer this, Chris.
I mean, so if element has the ID, that's really best approach. But currently our Vania side don't have any IDs. That's the reason I'm going for XPath or like CSS selectors.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. He needs selectors to select against to run the test, and if those data elements don't already exist, he has nothing to construct a test against, without also then taking on the responsibility of writing the templates himself.
Yeah, this is an argument about semantic web principles, I think, in most cases. And because the PWA is explicitly an application, the class names do sort of directly correspond to the identity of a component rather than to some stylistic attribute. So it makes sense logically to use the class, and adding an additional attribute, it adds weight to HTML that would be only important in testing and not in production, but it would be difficult for us to remove those attributes as part of a build process for production. So presently, this is the best approach, but I see what you mean, certainly. You don't want to overload classes. In our case, we think it's safe.
Well,
Okay.
the adding the additional weight of the HTML I think is trivial, but what I've seen done in other testing systems is for any given selector, you have it as something that's abstracted from the test suite itself, so that someone can change their selector arbitrarily. But whatever, we don't need to get into how to construct test suites and testing software. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, this is going to evolve.
Cool.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much, Dev. It looks fantastic, and I'm excited to see the next evolution of it. The next agenda item we have is for Mr. Kalkoben to show us some advances in the documentation, and I'm very excited about this. After that, if it's okay with Jimmy and with anyone else, maybe we can show off the new blog post that's available on the dev blog, and then we can discuss general issues. Mr. Kalkoben, you ready to show off the coding standards doc?
Yep.
All right.
Thanks, James.
Feel free to take over.
Share my screen. You guys see the repo? I take that as a yes.
My Blue Jeans is taking too long to update.
So as James mentioned, we have published our coding and project standards, and you can find it in our wiki right here, and in the side navigation under contributing. Basically, what this is a list of standards and conventions that you'll find used in the repository in the specifically Venia, but also in the other packages. It goes over things like naming, how we name classes and directories, and how we structure those directories. We also go over more architectural conventions like client state management, what we regard as middleware and application drivers. This is going to be a living document. We'll be updating this as we come up with new standard conventions that we want to follow. Since this was formed after code has been introduced in the project, there'll be instances where we don't follow these yet, but we are working towards getting up to these standards in the repository. Is there anything else you wanted to add, James?
I think it's important to note that not everything that's currently in the repository does fit these standards, definitely. And that each one of those things is, those that we've noticed, we're going to make the change. It's already backlogged for us to clean those up. And anything we haven't noticed, feel free to open an issue against it and hold us to our own standards. We're dog fooding. And the other observation I think it's good to make is that though some of these decisions seem like they're arbitrary, and maybe some of them are, if we all keep to a given standard, then this enables a lot of automated extensibility in the future. I mean, in Magento already, people are accustomed to using file system conventions like the etc directory and then the view.xml, module XML, di XML, and layout XML, all of which the system knows how to find. So I think this follows that expectation, and the sooner we establish these conventions, the sooner we can move forward with great extensibility concepts. I figure everyone on this call understands that, but it's still good to mention.
Right. Were there any questions on this wiki page? Cool. All right, I'll move on. The next update I wanted to show is this new tutorial section in the docs site. And so far we only have one set of tutorials called Hello Upward. Basically, it's an introduction to the Upward server and the Upward specification file. In this tutorial, you'll be going through and creating your own Upward backed application. In the first section, you'll be creating a server that returns a simple hello world string whenever you hit the server. In the second part, you'll actually be using templates to create an actual web page that has the hello world message. And in the final one, you'll be creating a React application that's backed by an Upward server. That's rendered by the Upward server, and that also says hello world or hello React world in there. And the purpose of this is to kind of to answer the question of how do I get started working with PWA Studios instead of just building off of Venya. So this is a first step to answering that question. There will be more tutorials that we add in the future, but this will serve as kind of a base project that people can use to play around with. Were there any questions? No questions?
Well, I just want to say this is one of the most exciting things that we have. And I'm really appreciative that you made it.
Thanks.
Like, for real. I just before this call, and part of why I was late to this call, was working with an interested team from a partner that reached out and asked to have a PWA masterclass and talk about feature implementation and stuff. And that's been great. It's been a wonderful time. I want to do more of those. But the ideal for any project like this is for it to be self-documenting to a great degree, and for the documentation itself to be the perfect companion. We're getting closer and closer to that, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, so stay tuned for more tutorials on how to use the stuff we provide in the studio. So.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we wanted briefly maybe to talk about the updated dev blog. We got a question in chat. Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you, Andres.
What's the question? Let's see.
Yeah, he just asked, he just said that's great. That's all. Just appreciation.
Thank you.
All right.
Do we have Jimmy here to talk about the dev blog? I have it pulled up.
Okay, well, yeah, you can share your screen. You can continue to share your screen if you'd like. Jimmy is not yet on the call. It's early for him, but I think we can just briefly say that the new dev blog is published and has a very, very clear and, well, in my opinion, inspiring description of the intent and roadmap and vision for the upcoming releases of PWA Studio. I'm still not able to see screen share updates. I'm not talking about it, but Blue Jeans is, very bad. So
can everyone else see the screen? Give And I'll see the blog.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I can
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So this blog should show that we've been doing a lot of careful thinking about the implementation model for extensions and about the purpose and the sort of clear documentation and role for each of our libraries and our components. I would encourage everyone to read it and for people to comment. As Jordan already has, I think Jordan's comment is ideal. It's just the word awesome, and everyone should post that.
Gotta show the love, right?
I'm giving him kudos for that. But maybe more importantly, if there's anything that you think needs clarification, this dev blog is, like all Magento dev blogs, a post on a forum, and so it encourages commentary. I think that the main takeaway is, again, that we've said this before, but that we want to encourage people to think about building their store compositionally. You want to make sure that it's possible to get started fast and that you can use existing concepts, which is why we're so thankful that folks like Jordan have made things like Fallback Studio. But increasingly, we'd like people to be able to consume Venia components sort of a la carte, taking each one and putting them into a larger app where you have control over the shell and you delegate pieces of internal functionality to third-party systems. We're just going to continue working on making that simpler and simpler and easier to get started with. So if anyone else has commentary, or anyone else on the call or in the chat has worked on this, because several people have, then feel free to chime in and add to or correct me. But I want to call out specifically Mr. Kalkman himself, and then also Lori Krell, who may or may not be on this call, but our partner and lead tech writer who helped to work on this and did a fantastic job with the final stages. And maybe biggest kudos go to Jimmy Sanford, who is the main author of this blog post. And if you don't know him, and I'm sure most of you do, he's the styling and Paragon tech lead on the project and the senior developer on the project. So thank you to Jimmy. Turns out he can write super well. We got to do something with that. And if there's somebody else who made a contribution, I'm sorry if I forgot to mention. Yell at me later.
So that's the end of my part of the agenda. I'll stop sharing.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So we're now at the part of the agenda that's fairly open. We still have a few minutes left. So if anyone wants to show something off or ask a question that we need to discuss in detail or pose a problem or issue for us that we need to escalate, now is a great time to do it. This isn't your only chance. Certainly, you can talk to us in the PWA, the hashtag PWA channel in the Magento Community Engineering Slack, or you can email us or talk to us directly. But if you have questions or comments now, feel free.
So maybe one question to you, James.
Yeah?
You mentioned something like a generator, just like Create React App.
Yes.
I know it's unfair to ask, but is there some sort of time frame on when you think there's something that we can play with, or
yeah,
is that too soon?
As soon as possible. Yeah, it's not unfair to ask, but it's unwise for me to say because we're dealing with some internal and external customers who are both releasing apps on PWA Studio and escalating things. We need to serve them and we need to serve you. And so our core team doesn't like to make date promises. But let me tell you about it in a little bit of detail. There's a couple things we need to do before we have a real generator concept. The first one, I think, is to have the concepts of the file system structure and the coding standards outlined so that our generator can make files according to those principles. And as Mr. Kalkabin has shown you, we've got that. That's great. The other thing we need to do is simplify Venia's code base and pull more of it into utilities and plugins. So for instance, the Webpack config is, I think, too large. It doesn't make sense to copy it into multiple projects. So we need to add to the concept of pre-configuration and extensibility before we do that. So full disclosure, I am working on some of that stuff. And I also am taken off for a week next week to go to an internal conference about PWA in Switzerland. So I hope that I can get some stuff done in the meantime, but if you're looking for something to play with, it may come in a little more than a week's time.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, I hope so.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, I'm at it anyway.
Sure.
In our custom project in the in Venia concept, you have a queries folder where you store all your GraphQL queries.
Yes.
And a while ago, I used to structure all my queries in subfolders. So you have queries and then a folder categories and a folder products, because I can see that in time you might have like 30 different queries, right? And
Yeah.
I thought you might want to structure it. I don't know why. Just for readability, I guess. And when I upgraded to the latest version of PWA Studio, it just said end of file cannot read there. And
Whoa.
it took me for a day to figure out why that happened. And it is because inside the PWA dev server, it is looking for, it's doing a read file on a directory. So my question is it a bug, or is that just something you don't want to do, like structuring your query files?
Oh, I'd call that a bug. It should be really easy for us to do a smarter read file than that. I think, yeah, it's just a simple implementation that iterates through the directory entries, and it doesn't check to see if they're files. You should be able to structure your queries folder, absolutely, and we should, in general, be parsing as much as possible all of the queries and query tags in the project, which we're not fully doing yet. So, I mean, definitely open that as an issue, and I agree that you should structure your queries. As a matter of fact, there's some disagreement inside our team, I think, about how much queries should be separated into different files, which we want to be totally open about. There's definitely a school of thought that says GraphQL's whole point is to be able to design your data requests specifically for your component. And even if it seems like that's making a lot of extra queries, the GraphQL client has a sophisticated way of aggregating them. So you should just write queries in line with your components. That's something that I think is a reasonable argument. We have separate query files so that we can do server-side calls in Upward in order to populate the initial templates, but there may be a compromise we can make between those two things. It's an ongoing conversation, which we can have in the public Slack if you'd like.
All right, cool. Yeah, I already raised an issue, but just wanted to know if it was really a bug or more of a structuring guideline or best practice to not do it.
Yeah, I'd
but
call
I think
that a
I
bug.
can. Yeah, and it's as you said, it's really easy to fix with just some basic globbing. Just restructuring the array. So okay, thanks.
Simple change. Thank you. All right.
Sure.
You're almost at time. Anybody have questions or comments, issues besides this?
I have some questions about Upward.
Sure.
This is Keith. I was able to go back and watch last week's, and I was unaware of this test tutorial that just came out. But I still just had a lot of high-level questions about Upward and understanding the reasoning behind it. And I don't know if I'm not really sure where to start. We can start at a high level. We can go into specific implementation or something else. But I guess if we were to start at a high level, I guess I'd want to understand, is Upward required to make use of everything else that's coming with PWA Studio?
Good question.
Okay, so yeah, let's start with that. Yeah.
Okay. It's the recommended approach. It's the happy path, so it's the most frictionless. But I would say no, it's not required.
Okay.
If you want to write a custom server, then you can, and the same PWA code should work. You may have to tweak the build process, but yeah, it's modular.
Okay. You say the happy path, and you talk about friction. It seems like there's a lot of friction with learning what PWA Upward is. Having to review and understand the spec, having to possibly install, maintain, test, and secure a middleware. Things that are perhaps already solved within the Node community. I don't know if you want to touch on any of those.
Oh, you're totally right. It's still not clearly messaged enough. Mr. Kalkoven, James, has done a great deal of work in this latest iteration to help with that, but I still owe the community another set of explanations that make things clearer. What I think, the last masterclass call, I think, had the same question, so you're not alone. I think the mistake that I have made is because Upward is kind of my baby, in trying to explain all of the different advantages I think it has at once, instead of starting with a single story that solves a single problem. Because I think it has great potential to aid in IT and deployment, et cetera, but I'm trying to talk about those things at the same time as I am about just basic front end stuff. And that seems to be confusing. So yeah, you're right, there's friction, and publishing the Hello Upward thing is one step. I'm also going to eventually host and schedule a webinar. I'm going to appear on a podcast next month to talk about it in a little more detail. But long story short is Upward is a system for a front-end developer to specify as part of their PWA code how the server needs to behave to deliver their PWA without having to dive layers down the stack and write server-side code in a particular language. Uh-oh.
Yeah, that's not really, I guess, concrete enough for me to really know, because obviously someone's got to write that code in some language.
Yeah, so, I know. The Upward server, so the Upward servers are generic HTTP servers, and they read the Upward file, the YAML file, and then they respond according to the definitions in that file. PWA is sort of a subset of all the things that a web server can do. Apache, Nginx, these servers, and even the Node HTTP server have a tremendous degree of customizability. You can deal with a lot of different MIME types. You can add or remove headers. You can do flow control. But a progressive web app has like a pretty strict set of best practices, right? Like most of the calls need to be idempotent. You want to serve fairly small payloads. You have proxy rules you want to define to the backing services, and then you have some simple rendering that shouldn't get too serious and too complex. So because of those best practices, we found it possible to write a sort of a domain-specific language which allows, as first-class concepts, those things. Resolve a template, deliver a file, proxy to another server or system, serve static files in a directory, etc. So the code exists to do that, and it's generic code. And you write pure configuration in order to get it to do what you need.
So I understand that aspect. I guess I'm concerned about all the implementation around it. You're talking about a benefit to the developer. Of course, there's a high cost too. I have to understand this spec and understand what's being developed internal without a lot of resources out in the world existing. Sure, they will come. But that may be a ways out, and there probably will not be a lot of examples to pull from initially. If we get into, obviously, without talking about specific implementation, just some of the implementation details that would need to be taken care of. or I guess maybe just to help me make aspects of it more concrete. So a request would leave, for example, my phone, and then hit the Upward server endpoint. And is that endpoint, is that where, let's say, for example, just trying to get into a couple of some, make it a little more concrete, like TLS termination is going to occur?
Upward doesn't need to handle TLS termination. One thing about Upward to remember, just if you're navigating the stack, is that it lives at the level of request response resolution. Upward is essentially like a purely declarative definition of handling all HTTP requests that a PWA client running the app may make.
Yeah, the Upward spec, but the actual runtime.
Yeah, you don't want to write anything that depends on that runtime. Right now, our cloud deployments, they don't do TLS termination at the Upward level, no. Upward exists in the stack underneath the cache layers like Varnish and TLS terminator. But certainly you can specify HTTPS in there.
So how am I going to scale this Upward server horizontally or vertically if I need to? Who's going to be writing the reference implementations of it? Who's going to be maintaining those? How is
so far we have written two, a JavaScript and a PHP one, and that we're both maintaining them locally. And because the Upward server is specified to be stateless, it can scale horizontally. The fact is that this is an early system. This is a young system. And we understand that there's disadvantages to that, and we appreciate the people jumping in and contributing to it. But what we want it to evolve into is something akin to GraphQL, where it's an additional layer. It's an additional abstraction layer. Some of the tools are still young, but it's something that you don't have to constantly refer back to the spec to use, because it's designed to be fairly understandable after a while, reasonable. It's you just keep resolving back up to the top of the file. If you write it in a pretty flat way, it should be fairly readable. But we're taking also input on that. We've already had people comment that there's things about the syntax that we've defined that aren't the most readable, and so we're trying to be reactive to that.
Yeah, that's an entire other element. Who's maintaining the spec and or I guess documenting the spec, because reading the spec. Looking at the example Venya Upward YAML, there's a lot of things that immediately strike me as not intuitive, and I guess as changes to the spec occur over time, or security issues are found with the spec, how is that going to be maintained? Who's going to be updating the middleware or pushing those updates to the middleware? It's not just a matter of writing the spec or writing a single implementation. There is a significant operations burden that comes out whenever you deploy or introduce a new middleware.
Yeah, that's true. But that's also true of any implementation. One reason that we
part of the difference here is if some of this stuff could be resolved either on the existing backend or certain routes or logic is contained on the client side, well, you've reduced some of the scalability issues as well as reduced some of the attack surface. Things that are happening on the the phone itself or whatever the client is, that's the attack surface of just that. It's not the middleware itself. Performance issues, once again, that's also on the phone or the client. But now you've kind of moved it into someplace in between, as well as potentially introducing, if not performance or security issues, additional network latency issues because you have yet another network hop.
It's the same as any middle tier server, and you do need a backend for front end to render the thing. So those are real concerns, but they're not particular to the Upward system. If you'd had a node middle tier, then you'd have to do the same thing. In the podcast I'm going to go on, Mage Talk, Kalen Jordan in the last episode where they talked about their own confusion with Upward, he mentioned that, we stated we don't want to make people host a node service in order to use all of this. And he wondered why that was, because it seems fairly easy to spin up a node server. He did so with Nuxt.js. But then he commented shortly afterwards that he was accustomed to PHP ops. It seemed really easy to start up the node server. He showed off his website to a few people, and then a couple days later, he found out he was getting 503s. People said his website wasn't responding. He went and he checked. He had no idea what was going on. The the application was running. What it was that there was a memory leak in the Node process, and because Node runs a persistent process, that's a bigger risk in the Node ecosystem than in PHP, which has this sort of single process model per request, and it's harder to do memory leakage. There's other performance issues. But so since Magento is a PHP system, and if we required Node.js, that'd be another system, we're effectively doubling the amount of ops knowledge required and the amount of deployment and CI/CD concepts required. This does add an additional layer of abstraction, and that's a difficulty early on. But we hope that it will resolve into the flexibility that allows people who have a certain ops expertise, be it Node or PHP or any other implementation, that they can deploy on their chosen stack and their chosen architecture and have it be maximally maintainable. It doesn't really add a layer beyond the middle tier that you'd have to write in any particular language.
Won't they have to develop a certain amount of ops expertise around this upward compatible service layer?
In as much as they would have to know upward, just like writing a GraphQL layer gives you advantages and then the disadvantage of having to maintain an extra knowledge base. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, so they're maintaining, testing, securing another service.
It is a new way of securing a middle tier service. It is a new way of creating
a new service that's not widely deployed. In fact, not even deployed yet.
By that you mean that it's just not in wide use?
Well, I mean, we have. Yes, it's on wide use, but we have a reference implementation. I mean, I don't know to what extent it's actually been deployed. Someone's actually using it in production.
Oh, I see.
Even if it was being used in production, I doubt that's like freely available for others to then use. I mean, I'm aware that obviously in PWA Studio, there's I don't know how you want to characterize it, a reference implementation.
Yeah, and there's Upward PHP too, which is already been tested and deployed into Pro Cloud. Though right now, I don't think we don't have anyone public who wants you to navigate their PWA Studio site, but we have some folks who are still soft launched who haven't agreed to let us publicize yet. So you can check them out. As far as we can tell, nobody's come back to us with serious scaling concerns, and they are starting to deploy on production hardware.
And are the upward endpoints the same endpoints as the Magento backends? Or I guess, should I say like on the same host or in the same data center, or however they're structured typically?
In the Pro Cloud with Upward PHP, they are, due to the constraints imposed on us by the replication strategy they use for Cloud Pro. Yeah, Upward PHP is running in the exact same document root, and then there's a Magento Upward connector module which takes over the front controller when it's installed. So yeah, running on the same hardware in that case, and works great. And then in the case of Cloud Starter and of our own Venia PWA instance, it's running on an entirely different tech stack.
So we have that PHP one. Is anyone actively using the Node implementation?
That's what VeniaPWA.com is using.
But that's that's a proof of concept. That's not production.
Absolutely true. No, like I said, no one wants yet to publicize their public store, but there are a few that are using a Node middle tier layer right now, and we're just at that moment in time where there aren't a lot of examples. No, you're right.
Right, and as implementation to the spec changes, obviously that runtime is going to have to be updated for both Node and PHP.
Yep, it's a module just like in, it's a composer or NPM module. So you intake semantic versioning updates the same way you would other server-side software.
Got it. How are updates to the spec anticipated?
Just as a quick time check, I don't want to dismiss any of these questions, and we can be on Slack. So I don't want to. I'm happy to continue this, but I want to make sure that there isn't anyone else on this call who has something to bring forth, because we have about 5 minutes left before people need to go. So sorry, I don't want to cut you off. Just need to for a minute to ask if anyone else has an issue to bring up. Okay, well, great. I'm glad that we're not delaying anyone from asking a question. So we can use the next 5 minutes to continue. Sorry to cut you off, Keith. You may go on, and we can keep.
Sure. I guess I'm curious with this, looking at the spec, if proposals come in, like, is there an RFC process, or like, how do you see that spec evolving with input from the community?
It needs to get formalized with proper BNF kind of notation, the same way that other specifications are, where BNF is appropriate, and then where not. We just need to use more sort of what WG style language, and then it'll be clear how to do an RFC for it. But much the same as Magento best practices themselves, a lot of these proposals occur in the Magento architecture repository. Are you subscribed to that one?
I'm not sure. I don't think so, no.
Yeah, it's a relatively new thing, so it makes sense. It's about, I'm gonna say 6 to 8 months ago, the architecture team under Anton and Olga, et cetera, chose to move all of our discussions and deliberations and proposals from an internal wiki onto a public GitHub repository. So you open proposals as pull requests that go into a large repository of markdown files. So not all of those things take the exact form that an RFC would traditionally, but they're all supposed to be human readable proposals that then get folded in as best practices. Potentially upward would be the same way, but I think if you look at other repositories for existing specifications, from Mustache to GraphQL to AdSafe, even older ones that are open source, then you can kind of see how that process would take place. But there's precedent for it.
Let me just, if you don't mind, just trying to help understand the YAML file, the spec as it exists. Things like, for example, at the beginning, the status, response status, headers, response headers, body, response body. Would those ever change?
So you're identifying something that we're missing that I really want us to get, which is that we need to make it clearer kind of what is built into the system and what is just a standard recipe. Good catch. That's something that is just a recipe, and we need to make that clear. So what you're seeing there with status is response status, headers is response headers, body is response body. I would say that would be the preamble to like 90% of upward files. Most of the time, you want the same system or the same logical path to resolve the status, the headers, and the body. But upward is designed so that you don't necessarily have to. If you have a service that you always want to return 200, you can just solidify that at the top and then just deal with headers and body from that point forward. So because it allows that, you need to specify that you're building a response object and that the top level status, headers, and body are going to be assigned to the final output that response object produces. So that's the recipe of response will be handled as a single thing by whatever is the terminator. Then the next recipe that you see in the Venia upward file is the standard routing recipe, which is that the resolution of the response object is based on a conditional resolver, which matches based on a regular expression against the URL path name. And that's the equivalent of writing a route in a router in any MVC framework. And there are additional recipes, but we need to definitely have like a library of those recipes and explanations of, how they translate to other systems.
Yeah, I'd love to see every possible key along with its corresponding every possible value.
That's in the spec.
Are defined. Okay, I wasn't able. Okay, I'll have to go look at the specs to see if I can identify those.
Yeah, I think one thing that might be unclear that you may be kind of identifying here that we need to tighten up is that there's only 3 top level keys that the system cares about, and that's status, headers, and body. It's a little bit like setting up any YAML file for CI. Like you can put arbitrary properties at root, but your Docker or your Circle CI or whatever, they're not going to pay attention to them until they're referenced.
Okay. I know we're running short on time, so I'll just make this my last question. When you say use app shell, you're then telling it to defer back to the application's shell running on the client?
App shell is a definition. So you see use app shell and nothing else. That always means that it's a reference to upper level context. So what it's saying is pass control flow to the thing that's defined as app shell at root. You scroll down through that file, you'll see something's defined as app shell. That itself is a conditional resolver. So you're just putting together a tree. App shell is, no matter what happens in that conditional resolver, it's always returning an HTML document to render an application shell. It just uses slightly different generators for the different top level concepts. Say your product page versus your CMS page. They might need to have different initial renders for maximum speed.
Okay, so maybe some of that confusion. I mean, I did see the app shell, defined further below, but because I had the spec with me, I wasn't quite clear. And of course, that's another hurdle as a developer. I have to now go and understand and fully understand this spec. But I guess another aspect I want to bring attention to is the naming of these things. If the names could perhaps, even the key matches, perhaps a better name would be, subject to match against.
Totally.
Because when I think of matches, I think of, especially as a JavaScript developer, if you're proposing that's the end user, the match method takes a regular expression. And here it's pattern is the regular expression, and matches is the thing that I'm matching against. When you say app shell, well, what does the front end developer think of when they think of app shell? They think of the application shell that's been developed or running on the client. I just think a lot more thought can be put into the naming of these keys.
Absolutely. I think one thing about the conditional resolver is that first regular expression matcher, our vision is that there ultimately will be a set of matcher operations that match that are exactly the same as the filter conditions in Magento APIs elsewhere. So that is already draft syntax that we do want to iterate on. But it's a totally valid criticism. Those names are ultimately probably going to be replaced with better ones and then slowly deprecated over time, just like anything.